This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Kia ora and welcome to another episode of Reserved Recommendations. This is the very first for Season 4? Are we Season 4? I think we're Season 4. Anyway, today I welcome back returning champion, my brother Angus, all the way from sunny Glasgow, where it is the opposite season. So I guess you're heading into spring? Question mark?
Yes. Spring has started to sprung.
Yeah, we're just starting to get the turn of autumn, so I figured that was probably accurate. And we are today talking about a thing which suddenly became topical after I decided to have this conversation with you. So we're talking about the game Spec Ops The Line, and as if on cue, Spec Ops The Line has been delisted from Steam and various other digital storefronts. If you still have it, you can still play it, but you can no longer buy it from a lot of places, though, as per the article on The Verge, from the 30th of January. At that point, you could buy it from GOG. So if you have a GOG.com account and you would like to go and play this game that we're talking about, like, pause the podcast and go get it, like, now.
I believe
because it may get delisted there as well.
I believe it has been delisted from GOG.
Okay, well, in that case, you must put on your eye patch and pirate hat in order to play this game if you do not already have a copy. And that's kind of interesting because it turns out that the problem was music licensing, essentially. The song uses Martha and the Vandellas' Nowhere to Run and Nowhere to Hide at one point during gameplay, and Jimi Hendrix's live version of the Star Spangled Banner as its like menu music when you first boot up the game, and the licenses that 2K Games had for both of those have just run out, so they had to delist the game, which, you know, Spec Ops The Line, spoiler warning, is a game that attempts to be an indictment of modern times in a number of ways, and it has been struck down by something that is also kind of an indictment of modern times in my view. The continuing predatory monetization of copyright from music from dead artists or art from long dead artists.
Yeah, and like I think if we're just gonna like tangent immediately, and so why not? Like it's a good warning light about digital platforms and the idea that games and digital stuff is around forever, because it was kind of this idea that if it's on the internet, it's never gone. Yeah.
Cory Doctorow had that phrased it as etawaf, everything that ever was available forever, and that, it turns out, is one of the few things that Cory Doctorow has been just profoundly and fundamentally wrong about.
Yeah, so like, if there is a thing out there in digital land that you are particularly fond of, and I think like this game definitely deserves to be preserved somehow, but like, or if there is something else that you think is cool and out there in the digital world, download it onto some solid piece of media. Like, even if it's a hard drive that you throw in a drawer somewhere, put it on something.
Absolutely, although with the warning that digital storage is in fact more volatile than we were told as well. You know, USB drives degrade with use. Magnetic media is vulnerable to all kinds of magnetic and electrical problems, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. It turns out a lot of the grand digital promise about a permanent perfect archive was in fact lies.
Yeah. Downloading it so that you have a copy of it somewhere to hand protects you from somebody deciding that, as in this case, it's not worthwhile, re-upping the copyright, and therefore it should be just not for sale anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get to the actual game itself, though, Spec Ops: The Line is a game which has things to say, and I mean that in and of itself is interesting for video games. I didn't realize until I had already played it and looked into it that the people who made it did so in the process rebooting a dead but reasonably successful third-person shooter franchise.
Yeah.
So Spec Ops as a lineage of third-person shooter action games goes back to 1998. There are I would have to go all the way through and let me count. I've got the Wikipedia article open. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. If you include expansions as releases, there are 9 Spec Ops games before Spec Ops: The Line. If you don't, then there are 7.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty
yeah, and I don't know, there I think there is a lot of scene setting that puts this game in context.
Well, that's the other thing I wanted to mention was that this game has it out for other video games, and I had somehow absorbed in my brain, and this is because of the way that the environment changed drastically not that long after this game came out. I would also need to open another tab to make sure I get my dates right, and I'm not sure if I can be bothered. We'll find out. But this game is a reaction against modern military shooters as they existed in 2012 when this game was created. And I had assumed that those were first-person shooters a la Call of Duty.
Yeah, so the big one... So this is a game that I started playing, must have got bored of and put to one side, and then you said, let's talk about this. And I had a week off work, so I sat down and played through, and then went and watched a bunch of video essays and stuff about it. So the things that the maker is... the point towards is Modern Warfare and Call of Duty, which are both first-person shooters.
Well, and so the thing is that Modern Warfare and what was it? Call of Duty and the other one that you said?
Modern Warfare.
Oh, okay.
Call of Duty and
no, because Modern Warfare is a Call of Duty, I think. But anyway. Call of Duty,
whatever the other big one is
also actually a reaction to the same game environment that this game is a reaction to. It just reacts in the opposite direction. So this game says the modern military shooter is, in the words of Hunter S. Thompson for the Kentucky Derby, decadent and depraved. And Call of Duty said the modern military shooter is clunky and not visceral enough. And so they are a split point of divergent evolution, because the modern military shooter up till Call of Duty had been third-person squad tactical games the way that Spec Ops: The Line is. And Call of Duty as a franchise is largely responsible for shifting that entire genre into the first-person shooter style rather than the third-person tactical squad thing.
Yeah, and also Call of Duty and Warfare or whatever the other one is, certainly also does things like those are also franchises. So it's whatever the ones that were coming out in 2012 were the ones that were starting to push towards like accurate models of guns and gritty, realistic play and that sort of stuff. With huge air quotes around like gritty, realistic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there is a focus on a particular kind of realism which elides a lot of the uglier aspects of war, except insofar as those are in some way cinematic.
Yeah, and like while lots of people talk of this game as a reaction to those things, I think, having played it recently, that it is also a very 2012 game.
Yeah.
In that you are 10 to 11 years after 9/11. You are 10 to 11 years into the forever war that was Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And also I think like and I don't know to what degree this is deliberate, and we can kind of get into it as we talk about like specifically what happens in the game. But I feel like a lot of people read this game as an indictment of the violence of war, and a critique of that is that you see around a lot is that the game presents you with these choke points where you kind of have to make some sort of a violent choice that's going to have a really bad outcome, but you can't actually progress without doing it. So trying to hold the player morally responsible for doing something awful that you make them do in order to progress is in some way morally invalid. And I think the ending of the game invalidates that it would invalidate that as a critique that the game was trying to make, because there's this idea that, like, if you're trying to make the point that the nature of warfare is that these awful things happen to people, but then your final conclusion, which is the final conclusion of the game, is that the protagonists shouldn't have been in the situation, didn't need to go there, and went there for entirely personal reasons, completely unrelated to anything to do with like the goals of the military campaign that they're involved in or their orders or anything like that. That then is like a story about one guy going off the rails, not about the fundamental nature of warfare, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think that certainly like makes sense, right? Like it is so like if you have seen Apocalypse Now or read Heart of Darkness, I think actually more if you have seen Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, like this is a game based on movies that are based on Heart of Darkness more than that this game is based on Heart of Darkness, I think.
Yeah. But like from the opening scene, you understand that this is paying a lot of homage. I mean, even from the like menu screen, you get that this is paying homage to like, you know, such movies as Apocalypse Now, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess like there's a comparison I would draw to there's a video on the Shadow of the Colossus and its various adaptations. I think I'm thinking of the one by Dan Olsen, scaffolding ideas, where he talks about like lack of player agency in that game. Like there's only one way that the narrative can go. Mm-hmm. And he talks about that being like one way of thinking about it being like a reenactment of a story rather than necessarily you take on a role and are like have perfect agency within that role. It's like you're retelling the story of this guy who did these things. And so they're always going to do the same stuff.
Yeah. And like, I think like from stuff that I have read from the people who developed this game, there was a feeling of like, you can just it's just a game. You can turn it off and walk away if you don't like the choice. Which is an interesting call. I'm not sure if I buy that particular thing, but certainly like, so let us quickly set the scene as much as it needs to be set. The game takes place in Dubai that has been hit by a kind of unending sandstorm. And you are a crew of Delta Force tactical operators sent in to see if anybody's alive and send in and call for evacuation if there are survivors. And there is a point where your character continues on past, like, discovers that there are people alive and then continues on to do more stuff. And like, that's the downfall, right? Like, that's the downfall of his character is that decision to go, well, actually, I'm just going to keep going on, right? And so, yeah, sure, you can't choose to do not bad things from that point, but I think that's the point.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, insofar as it's a critique of military action per se, which I mean, I do think the kind of the eventual reveal of, you know, spoilers for a over 10-year-old game, but
let us stop people here. It is really, really worthwhile. If you haven't played this game, go play it now.
If you can get a copy of Spec Ops: The Line, and you do not know what we are about to talk about, because I do not think it is possible to discuss this game in the context of a reserved recommendations episode without total spoilers. Like, I think that is just going to have to be how it is. Yeah, pause the episode, go play Spec Ops: The Line. I would recommend just cranking the difficulty down to easy, because one of the things I think we're going to talk about is that some elements of gameplay are shit.
Yeah. Especially on the PC version, boy howdy.
Yeah, you're going to find that if you try and play it on normal or hard, there are some points where you are just going to get mad because the challenge is unfair, and the way that the like cover and dodge and squad control mechanics work is counterintuitive and also just doesn't work very well.
Yeah, it is a bad port from a console game to a PC game if you are playing it on PC.
Which is weird, because normally like tactical or first person shooters are much better with mouse and keys because it's easier to aim. But yeah, not in this case.
Anyway, sorry.
So yes, assuming that we have got rid of all of the people who either want to play Spec Ops: The Line unspoiled or like haven't already played it, again, this is a game from 2012. It is the year of our Lord 2024. This is 100 years in game time. The final reveal of the game is that that your main character has suffered a break from reality and is hallucinating the the radio communications that he is getting from the commander that he is trying to find, and has done the entire operation off his own bat outside of the scope of his orders completely in vain, looking for a dead man. And so what I was saying was, I guess, that when that's your final twist, the only way in which you can critique war or militarism, I suppose, is that, I guess, they make a point about like the desire to be a hero being what leads your main character onwards. I've actually forgotten the main character's name because he's such a generic, like Joe McMilitary guy. He really doesn't.
Wallace.
What? Yeah, like it really doesn't matter. I think it's Walker. Walker, that's his name.
Walker, there we go.
He's but like, I think it deliberately doesn't matter in the way that a lot of military shooter protagonists are like blank slate growly men. But the way in which it's a critique of the military and militarism is that the fact that Walker and his two crewmates, Adams and Lugo, are dudes with guns means that violence is the outcome of every encounter. And so, like, that's sort of a critique, but the fact that the entire plot is positioned as the outcome of Walker suffering a break from reality pretty close to the start of the game, that, you know, that kind of undermines the idea that there's anything systemic at fault.
So I think there's the thing that I think gets overlooked in this game is there's a sort of B plot around the CIA being in Dubai. Mm-hmm. And like they are raising the refugees against the soldiers and doing various things to mess around with. But there's this kind of idea that gets brought through, especially because like the CIA guy is responsible for crashing the water supply and, you know, damning everybody in the city, that like everybody would just be better if the US wasn't involved in any way, right? Like they're just like, there is a level at which there is a critique here, which is just like, this is partially the US fighting the US, and secondly, like this from the civilians' point of view, everybody would be better if like they hadn't turned up.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is the way in which you can get a coherent critique out of US military adventurism out of this, is that from the point at which Conrad, who was in fact in charge of the original attempt to evacuate Dubai, became involved with his, I forget the name of it. It's called the 33rd, but I can't remember if it's like a division or I can't remember US Army denominations of chunks of guys. But the moment that it's a battalion. There you go. The moment that the 33rd Battalion and Conrad got involved, everything got worse, and that's what, like, the realization of that is what has led in the background to Conrad's suicide, which you like find out at the very end of the game. Mm-hmm. And like, yeah, I think that is a coherent critique, certainly. I think there was a lot of hay made about particularly the white phosphorus incident, which again, like if you haven't played the game, that is a thing to experience sight unseen. If you have again made it this far, go back. But there is a point at which you are presented with too many troops to handle, and you deploy white phosphorus using a drone and a mortar, so that all you can see is little dots on the ground getting wiped out by like clouds of white fire, and it's deliberately very evocative of the kind of like power fantasy gun emplacement sections in Call of Duty and related games. I believe that
I think it's all but ripped from like one of those games. I pretty much remember that there is like a kind of famous section in either like Modern Warfare or Call of Duty where it must be Modern Warfare where you know you're flying you are a gunner in a helicopter at night or something like that.
Yeah, and it's a deliberate call out to like UAV footage from the war on terror and that sort of thing as well. Like all of that like night scope footage of really tiny figures being obliterated by bombs from a million miles away. You deploy white phosphorus in that manner to wipe out all of the enemy troops who are in your way. And then when you walk through the resultant carnage, you find that you have also obliterated a huge number of civilians. And that moment is like, it is really gnarly and really kind of viscerally affecting. And I do think that it is worth witnessing. Particularly, Oh no, you go.
So there is so much which is like there is a thing about people talking about games as art, and I think this is certainly a game that gets to be put up there as no, seriously, these things have been art, because there are so many really interesting and exciting choices made in this game. And one of the things is because they are saying, hey, we want you to stop and think about what you are doing in modern shooters. In a different game, if this was just like, woohoo, war is cool, you would fire your white phosphorus and then scene would cut and you would go to somewhere else. It would be, your new mission, Bond is to, or whatever. But this game, and it does it in a couple of places, goes, okay, you did that. Now walk, not run, not, drive, walk through what you just did.
Yeah. And interestingly, like, one of the mechanics in this game is that if someone gets knocked down, you can use like a quick melee attack to instantly execute them, and you can't. So while you're walking through the aftermath of your white phosphorus bombing, before you even get to the bit with the civilians, there are just like dozens of enemy combatants who are, I think by this point, mostly also US troops. You're killing people who are even on your side insofar as that matters. And they're just like crawling around and begging for death, and you don't get the execution prompt. So you could, in theory, shoot them, I suppose, but like, ammo scarcity is a real thing, so that would genuinely make your progress significantly harder if you decided to. You can't just go around and quick kill them all. You just have to walk through them like moaning in pain and begging for death.
Yeah, and like it is harrowing. And, like, I think there is a lot of stuff that this game manages to do because it earns it. Earlier on in the, game, you are fired on with white phosphorus. and like, you know, the tension has been ramping up, so it can kind of make sense. You're like, oh well, like, yeah, I guess that's what we have to do, right? So like everything up to that point is earned.
There's actually an earlier, much more minor point that where it does something which I can't decide if I like or not. It's right at the point where you're presented with this situation where elements of the 33rd are rounding up civilians, and your character interprets that as they're like concentrating them to do something bad because the civilians are trying to get away from them. And it's later revealed that they were probably trying to put them somewhere for safekeeping so that they could attempt to make another evacuation attempt, and that's what you stymied with your white phosphorus attacks, and those were the people that you killed. But there's a point where you're kind of shooting your way through these soldiers, and one of them chases a civilian woman towards you, and you will be, by that point, so conditioned to shooting that you have a good chance of shooting her.
Yeah.
I did. I because I was like already so conditioned and harried by the game that when a fast-moving thing came at me, I just blasted it down. And the thing I'm not sure whether I like or not is that the game lets that pass completely without comment. Like, it makes you walk through the aftermath of the white phosphorus thing. But if you shoot that woman, you just shoot her. No one ever mentions it. No one, like, you don't have to sit with that because you will continue to be under pressure. She's being chased by an armed guy who will shoot at you, so you have to also fight him. So it like the game immediately moves on from it, but it's a thing that just will happen. And if you don't correctly identify the target, you will just gun the civilian down.
Yeah. I think there is certainly a feeling that this game sets up a bunch of bait and switches, right? Like, it sets up a lot of things and goes, well, actually, no. I think that is something that it does well, and maybe could be argued that is part of it. Because, like, even in the beginning, right, your first people that you meet are what we believe are, you know, refugees. You know, the first hostiles are just, you know, refugees. And like, if we're going to be really blunt about games of that era, random Middle Eastern man with AK-47 was the default antagonist at that time, right?
Yeah, and they do immediately shoot at you, which is like later proved to be a reasonable thing for them to do, but also puts you in the position where you kind of have to shoot back because that is the verb with which you interact in this game. But yeah, like they are absolutely doing that on purpose.
But very quickly, like that doesn't stay, like you very quickly switch in the game from that being your from your primary enemy to other US soldiers being your primary enemy. And it's like, I think a thoughtful, well-planned game would have just, you know, quite happily fallen into lazy tropes for much longer.
Yeah, I think so. So we are at a fascinating point in our conversation, but it is time for us to take our halfway break. So we are going to do that now, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irarangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This is Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast about great trash and difficult art. And this episode, I am talking to my brother, Gus, about the game Spec Ops: The Line. You were just saying that a less thoughtful game could easily have fallen into like lazier tropes, particularly with the kind of foreign setting. Like they're deliberately kind of playing around with white savior narratives and that kind of thing. I think a point of comparison there would be like Max Payne 3. Max Payne 3 I really like. I really like all of the Max Paynes. I am a Max Payne head, if you will. But Max Payne 3 makes a lot of hay out of Max being like this dumb American white savior. It's set in South America, and the main character is kind of manipulated by various factions to do violence against their enemies in a complicated plot that's not really worth going into here. My point is just that, like, the game makes a lot of hay out of Max being manipulated into being this kind of American white savior who just comes to a foreign country and does a bunch of violence. But in commenting on that, you also spend a lot of time shooting brown people who speak Spanish. So, like, you run into that challenge of trying to satirize a thing without just doing the thing.
Yeah. And I think there are definitely, I think again, like, it's a weak criticism of this game that it does the same thing, right? Like, that it does the, like, oh, but you're just making like a fun shooty game.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because you talked about bait and switches, and I think that there is like a fundamental bait and switch at the core of the game, because part of the way that it operated when it first released, and this is part of the experience that you can never get back, really, because kind of anyone who knows anything about this game knows at the very least that it is in some ways a critique and inversion of modern military shooters from its time. But it set itself out to present like a modern military shooter. Like, their goal, as far as I can tell, was for it to feel like you were playing a modern military shooter that was going mad around you. And one of the ways that they do that is, like, they have all of the standard, like, multiplayer and all of that stuff right there in the main menu to say, like, this is a game that you can have as, like, game as sport or game as like collective hobby, the way that a Call of Duty or something is. Like, we're setting you up to believe that you're going to play through the campaign to get a sense of how this game goes, and then you're going to sit down with your friends or maybe like remotely with your friends and play a whole bunch of deathmatch Spec Ops: The Line, which is just like, once you've actually played the game, that sounds awful.
And like, that's the thing that, like, it's really I think is really useful to try and get into people's heads, is how well crafted the downfall of Walker is and how much that affects you as the player's experience, right? So one of the things is this is a game where you will die a lot and, be back on a loading screen. And at the start of the game, the loading screen will be things like, hey, you can, like, get your teammates to help out. Walker used to serve with Conrad. Adam's favorite thing is whatever. Let me see if I can find some of the stuff. towards the end of the game, the like loading screen says things like, to kill for yourself is murder, to kill for your government is heroic, to kill for entertainment is harmless.
Yeah, no, they are like absolutely like degrading the fabric of the actual game around you as it happens. And one of the things that I found interesting is like there is a PS3 look, right? So this game was released as a in the PS3 era. I don't remember what Xbox version that is because I hate Bill Gates with the power of 1,000 suns, and so I interact with his products as little as I can feasibly manage, despite doing everything on a Windows platform. And that's why I hate Bill Gates with the power of 1,000 suns. However, there is a PS3 look, part of which is that everything glows in a really unpleasant and unhealthy looking way. And like that's effective for this game, but also that's just how everything looked. But like playing it with all of the settings turned all the way up on my modern gaming laptop, this game looks quite good. Yeah.
Like I think that's the other thing, right? Like it is also like a testament to, we used to make stuff. No, but like but like, no, really, like, less about, how many polygons there are in things, but like, there are artists on the Jaeger team, Jaeger being the developer. There are artists whose job it is to make things look good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would connect this with the first like BioShock game. I'm just looking that up to see when it came out. So BioShock's 2007. It's also published by 2K, although like it's a different studio within 2K. But there are lots of moments as you're going through Dubai, which I think was deliberately chosen for this reason, where you get like the BioShock completely deranged, opulent spaces, hopelessly ruined vibe.
Yes. Yeah.
And that stuff is just gorgeous.
Yeah. And like this reminds me of like another thing that, as I said, I kind of got obsessed with this game for a moment after finishing it and watched a bunch of people talk about it. You may not have noticed, but you only ever go down.
I had not noticed that, but you are correct.
You only ever descend in this game. Which is, again, like, it's not something that you notice until somebody points it out, but that somebody has put that much thought into stuff does affect your feelings, I think.
Yeah, and like, you're right. And some jiggery-pokery has happened in order to make that happen, because you do go from like walking through the desert to descending a skyscraper. And so they have to kind of elide that transport so that you don't feel yourself climbing. But you're right, you only ever walk along or go down.
Yeah. And like, yeah, like it's really also an interesting study in the little bits, because as you said, like you can melee attack people, execute people on the ground, and it starts off as a pretty perfunctory exercise, but as Walker gets more insane, it becomes more brutal. And it's not something that you really notice until you notice it, and you're like, that seemed a little bit like a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And towards the end, you get a guy who recognizes you and begs you to stop before you do the execution. Again, like it's slightly it slightly undercuts itself, because if you don't immediately kill that guy, then he will kill you. And so like that was the one point where it felt like it was just a touch cheap for me. Because
it did feel a bit like, it did feel kind of cheap heat.
That bit felt, because it was actually in the flow of gameplay, addressing the player rather than the character necessarily, and then punishing you for listening to it. That felt cheap, just to me. But you're right. Like the executions get gnarlier, and they do a really good job of humanizing the people that you're killing. Like there are lots of just kind of passing moments of dialogue where the people that you're about to do murder on are really normal and kind of nice to one another.
Yeah. Or like, I don't know, like, I think like shitty in like the sort of ways that people who work together are, right? Like just, you know.
Yeah. There are some people who are villainous, but they're villainous, or who are monstrous, but they're monstrous within the context of like, they're trying to do this military operation and these three guys have shown up and started killing a bunch of people. And that's a problem that they really need to solve before they can get on to the next thing. And because it's a military situation, solve means kill more people.
Yeah, I mean, also it's just like, you know, there's a lot of people bitching about like cigarettes and stuff, right? Like it's very just, you know, people who have it. Yeah.
It's in the words of Joe Kasabian of the podcast Lions Led by Donkeys, soldiers are always soldiers and will always be soldiers and have always been soldiers. There is kind of universal like ground level grumbling shittiness that is the being a soldier experience. And some of the people that you meet are channeling that.
But like, I think that's also like important to like point out, like it would be again cheap heat to make them either mustache twirling, evil people, or like, you know, look at this picture of my like pregnant wife and 42 orphan children that we have back home.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like you don't want to try and make them saintly. That would be too weird, and it would break the verisimilitude of the setting. So, I think one of the things that is worth talking about before we finish, because we are coming up rapidly on the end of the episode. And look, this is why you should play this game. If you have decided that you should listen to us spoil it before you do so, there's a lot of shit to talk about. I did think that the way that, like, again, I did feel like the madness is kind of cheap heat as far as an explanation for what's going on. Like, I have the same thing whether it's movies or video games or whatever. If the solution to, like, all of the awful shit that's happening is it's all in the protagonist's head, even if the rest of it has been really cool or affecting or skillful or meaningful, it always just makes me go, just a tiny little bit inside. I call it like one psychic damage. But I think having done that, the way that it handles the ending is quite interesting.
Yeah, and like to that, like again, I think you're right. Like, it was all a dream is a bit like cheap heat, like not cheap heat, but just like it's often an easy way out.
It's like it undermines the way that mental illness actually is in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It cheapens.
What I was going to say is, that being said, like I have firstly seen like some people who are more better versed in PTSD stuff say that actually some of the ways that it talks about, like that it demonstrates, in like slightly cartoony video game stylings, but like how that sort of stuff works. Like there is an initial event and then something else, a loud chaotic event, will set off a flashback.
Certainly, and I think the way in which it communicates the way that you are channeled into violent action by circumstances that you can't really understand just happening too fast for you to process them, that's really effective. And one of the points they make about Walker is that he's already a veteran, and one of those loading screen moments that you alluded to is that he doesn't like to talk about what happened in his last deployment, which suggests that there is PTSD and that he maybe did some stuff that he's not proud of personally. But it's just the specific hinge of this was all imaginary.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. Like, I think I have some time for it, partially because, like, because it feels so close to something like, Apocalypse Now, etc., where like the end point of that movie is more to do with the main character. Like once I had grokked that that's the journey that we were on, it kind of felt like that was the only place it could go.
Although I mean, both Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now end with a confrontation with an actual person who exists and is still alive, who has used the machinery of either colonialism or the military-industrial complex, depending on which one you're talking about, to build themselves this awful private kingdom full of horrors. And Conrad in Spec Ops: The Line is actually more innocent than that. Like, he is a guy who his only moral choice would have been to leave the military before the events that precipitated the events of the game. And he came into an impossible situation, attempted to do his best, discovered it was impossible, and killed himself.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, there's lots of things. Like, he's chosen to take his troop in there. But I mean, also, I think, like, one of the...
Well, wasn't Conrad specifically ordered to do the evacuation?
No, it's set up in the intro thing.
I missed that.
To go in there.
Right. Now, I knew Walker chose to go in to find out what happened, but I hadn't realized that Conrad chose to go in and attempt to do the evacuation.
Yeah. But also, I think, like, that last reveal, if you are thinking of the game as a indictment of the player, right, like, is kind of necessary, because it, like, to drive home the, like, none of this was necessary, right? Like, just none of it.
Yeah. Although, I mean, as I already said, I feel like the game is at its weakest when it's attempting to indict the player rather than make the player witness to the inhuman actions of a character who exists to do those things so you can witness them. Like, just because of the way that the game does deliberately rob you of agency so that you have to do some war crimes. The the indictment of like, are you not entertained by this carnage is a bit. That bit is the bit that seems like the weakest of the critiques that the game is attempting to mount.
Yeah. Yeah, like I like, I kind of came into it knowing that these, like, I do not have any great fondness for like modern shooters et al. Like I kind of agree with the game. So like there are some, as you say, there are some very gripping and like affecting scenes, and I didn't kind of come away from that not having been affected by the game. But what I found interesting was, as I kind of did some reading and doing some lot of ground, I saw a lot of people go, no, this made me like turn off modern shooter games, right? Like, or at least have a really long, hard think about.
Yeah,
like,
and I think the critique of that style of entertainment is a bit different from the critique of the player for enjoying fictional violence, right? Like,
yeah,
I think that critique is absolutely valid. I agree with you. I am also not a fan of the modern military shooter, or the philosophy behind it, or the fact that it attempts to pretend that there isn't any philosophy behind it. But I think like attempting to say that you are a bad person for enjoying fictional violence is a weaker critique.
Yeah. Yeah, like, because I think there is, like, the fact that this game thinks about and tries to engage with the player is interesting. And, like, I don't know, like, again, we're not sure how much that hits, but there are certainly things, like, again, as you get into the last section of the game, one of the loading screen tips is, this is your fault.
Yeah, and one of the things the game did, which I don't know if I can be bothered, because some of the moment-to-moment gameplay in this game is, as mentioned, shit. And I don't know if I could be bothered going through the frustration of doing that just to see for a second time how things play out. But there is a subtle and crafty trick they pull where they will present you with a moral choice, like a binary choice moment, essentially, without saying necessarily what mechanical action you should take to make which choice. And so that is an interesting indictment on the player, because your choice is defined by what action you take in gameplay, and and it's not necessarily clear which is which, so you have to do a little bit of kind of lateral thinking, and it's not always clear that you are being presented with a choice, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's again, like, it is a very smart and well thought out game.
And so specifically, there were moments where I was prompted to shoot one of two things, or presented in a situation where it seemed like I needed to kill someone, and actually thinking back on it, and this is where this is your fault does come in. You could actually shoot into empty space in some of those moments, and that would probably actually count as a binary choice within the game's logic, and it would probably respond to that as a choice, and like that is an interesting critique, in that you will realize that you shot at something rather than at nothing because you're conditioned to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely there. Yeah, there is. Yeah, there are a bunch of of those little moments.
So the final one of those, and I kind of want to finish here because we are running long now, but is the very, very end of the game is one of those like choice but not defined in a like push Y to do this thing choice moment is that you are presented with a final well, actually no, there is an end point to the game that you can get to before that if you do some other stuff that we won't get into. But assuming you make the kind of default player logic choice, you're presented with a final situation where a convoy comes in to try and rescue people, and basically the only person left is Walker, now completely 1,000-yard stare, gone, armed with an anti-tank rifle and wearing Conrad's jacket. And you have the opportunity, because you are armed, to either surrender or try to fight the people who are trying to rescue you. And the interesting thing I think that the game does is that none of those are canonically the correct ending, I think. Like,
yeah.
I didn't have the patience to actually kill all of the troops who are trying to rescue you. There is an ending that happens if you do that, and I just didn't have the gameplay chops and patience to bother doing that one. But I did surrender and then wait out the credits and reload and fight them to see what happened in both cases. And they're both quite poignant and well-crafted scenes to the point where you don't feel like one is the finger quotes good or correct and or bad or incorrect ending.
Yeah. And again, like with all things of this game, like none of the endings like give you roses, right? Like they are tying up the end of the story in a way, but none of them are like,
no, what they are all good endings in the sense that they feel like a logical end point for that character and the things that he's gone through, and which one of them you choose is kind of it's about how you read where the character is at and what you think the most logical end of the movie, if you want to think of it in that sense, like which final scene you think is most either effective or the best narratively logical endpoint, more than it is like a reward for doing the correct thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like it, like, yeah. Again, it has earned the endings that it puts on.
Yeah, and I think like maybe a framework that you could use if you wanted to talk about this game in like a theatrical concept would be to think about it in the context of a tragedy, right? Like,
yeah,
there is a set of circumstances which includes the mental health of the main character, but there is a set of circumstances that means that the outcome of this story is in some ways predetermined within a certain set of parameters. But it's still worth going through that to see how it plays out and what it shows you along the way.
Actually, like, I think you're right? Like, just to drag this on towards the closing point. But like,
this is like, why you listen to the podcast, so you get the long version.
So if we frame this game in the like framework of a tragedy, right? Either Greek or Shakespearean, take your pick, because they're kind of echoes.
The
of
thing
both.
is that the Greek one is slightly thicker and more sour.
Yes, but like we have this point where like at the start of the game, your like Walker is a cool, calm, tactical operator. He is like his forward momentum is the thing that carries him through a lot of situations and does him very well. Does him, does him in good standing. It's
like the beginning of the game, you do feel pressure, particularly if you play it on like normal or harder, but you do feel like a combat effective badass, and albeit like a pain in the ass to get them to work properly, your team commands do make you feel like you have this highly trained unit at your disposal doing cool operator stuff and dominating the opposition.
Yeah, you are like a stone cold killer, an operator, right? And by the midpoint of the game, like the point where of no return, the white phosphorus moment. Firstly, you have a Greek chorus there of like Lugo and Adams going, "This is a bad idea. This is a really bad idea. This is a really bad idea." But that tragic flaw of being, the operator, the mission, and
also like the conditioned both the character and the player to be like, I am the white savior protagonist of this story, therefore what I do is going to be correct, because if it's not, the story can't progress.
Yeah, and like I'm saying, right? Like that's his tragic flaw, and then like as you say, the like it's all kind of written in fate, as it would be in a like a Greek tragedy, but it's important that we all watch it play out.
Yeah. I want to make one final point against this game before we sign off, and this is one that I think is understandable, but also in some ways weakens its case. But I do believe in streamlining a story for a specific medium, and sometimes that means that you have to leave out stuff that's germane. If you want a really good example of that, go watch the movie Let the Right One In. It is a affecting horror romance about I think he's 11 or 12-year-old boy who falls in love with his next door neighbor, and it turns out she's an immortal vampire. And it all takes place in Sweden, and it's very black and grim. Well, I mean, it's like heartwarming and gross at the same time in a way that's very interesting. And then go and read the book of the same name that the movie is based on. The book has so much more stuff in it, including explaining some sort of weird behavior by a main character or a like large looming supporting character in the movie, by the fact that character in the book is a pedophile who is being like bribed with the promise of sexual favors to do things, and gets like distracted by his urges sometimes, which like puts him in bad situations. The point is that explaining all of that stuff in the context of the movie would have turned it into like a 10-part TV series, because you couldn't do justice to it in the straightforward flow of like an hour and a half movie. Similarly, in this game, all of the focus is on violence, and I get that is because the main verb of shooters, military shooters included, is shoot. but that is not the sole vector of harm of armed conflict. And the fact that this game kind of elides out of existence all of the like famine and sexual violence, and it doesn't really get rid of the consequences of infrastructure destruction because you participate in some, but like there is a whole broader category of war harms, and I think particularly like the sexual violence part of it that this game just does not deal with at all. And I want to forgive it because on the one hand I want to forgive it because it's trying to encapsulate what it's doing in a very economical way, but on the other hand I think that taking on the moral depravity of war per se and limiting that to just talking about violence is like, that is a limiting lens which tends to undermine the fundamental horror of warfare.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think, as you say, they did their best that they could in like 2012 as the subsidiary of 2K Games.
Yeah, and if the press had been like, there is rape in this game that you need to deal with the consequences of, that I can absolutely see how that would have derailed the conversation.
Yeah.
And it would have thrown the game into SJW discourse in a way. Do you remember the SJW wars of the 2010s? Yeah. In a way which would have absolutely like derailed all other possible conversations. So I can absolutely understand why they didn't do any of that stuff. I just, as I say, feel like in some ways it's one of those things where it feels like a high school essay rather than a university essay, if you like. It feels like your critique is correct but incomplete.
That's in it. But like again, right? Like how much critique can you get into a video game?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And there is a virtue in deciding to do one thing in a coherent way rather than 57 things in an incoherent way. So thank you very much for talking today, Gus. Again, like if you have the stomach for quite visceral violence and you can get hold of this game and you somehow have listened to all of this without playing it, I would reservedly recommend that you do so. You will be frustrated with the moment-to-moment gameplay, but this is a case where I would suggest that you persevere and push on through. Have you other things, Gus, that you would recommend that people check out that do a similar, like walk a similar tightrope of like critiquing and portraying violence at the same time?
Not that I can bring to mind.
Okay, I would suggest that a game that plays with some similar ideas, although it's a very different moment-to-moment experience and in a lot of ways more abstracted, would be the Hotline Miami series. That is a game series about getting really, 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 really good at calculated violence while making that violence far, far gorier and more visceral than you would expect in like a top-down sprite-based game. And also like does some stuff about messing around with the player's perspective in a way that's quite interesting, even if it's a hell of a lot like cartoonier than this game.
Yeah. Let me just quickly think while I scroll through my Steam library.
Also, if you're into like if you're willing to indulge in PS3 era third-person action games, I did mention Max Payne 3. I would suggest playing Max Payne 3. It is a game that sets itself some really ambitious goals in terms of like talking about addiction and talking about American adventurism and talking about violence. And I don't know that it achieves those goals the way that it hopes to, but it makes a really interesting attempt. And also, I think that people have fundamentally underestimated how clever and envelope pushing in terms of like, let's try and do something interesting with this one, guys, each successive Max Payne game has been.
Yeah. Receiver 2 is a game that I'll put here. It is a very simplistic shooting puzzle game, ? You are put in a procedurally generated level where there are turrets that you need to shoot with painstakingly realistic guns. You need to open, if you have a revolver, you need to open the revolver, open the cylinder, drop all the cartridges out, manually load them, put them back in, spin the thing so you're there. If you haven't done something right, if you have your gun cocked and try and put it away, it will shoot you. While you collect tapes, which are meditations on kind of conspiracy and violence, there's a huge trigger warning of like suicide in that game, because one of the failure states is you shoot yourself, but like it's really a very interesting and compelling game, and very interesting to compare to modern shooter games, because again, right, each of the guns do things like jam, and you have to like rack the slide repeatedly to try and unjam them, and you have to like maintain and like actually interact with the object of a gun, rather than just have it as a item slot as it was.
That sounds fascinating. I will potentially go and investigate that probably once I am done with Disco Elysium, which is currently turning my brain inside out. Thank you once again for coming and talking on the show. This has been a really, really fun discussion. You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.